Words like sadistic and bloodthirsty are what prosecutors call this English couple, now convicted of one of the most gruesome murder cases we've ever covered. These two lured a mother to their flat, tortured her, murdered her, dismembered her body with power tools, and then stuffed her remains into a suitcase before leaving parts of her body across a 9-mile stretch in South London. If that's not enough to make your skin crawl, the texts and messages between this couple might just do it. They wrote about sexual humiliation, bestiality, and cannibalism that they called, quote, cooked flesh, maybe even rare, so blood drips down our faces. On top of all of that, one of the killers was already a convicted murderer who was seen laughing after stabbing that victim to death. This is the disturbing case of Sansom and Gemma Watts and their brutal murder of Sarah Mayhew. This case takes us across the pond to England, specifically New Addington. It's part of South London and the London borough of Croydon. On March 8, 2024, 38-year-old Sarah Mayhew, a mother of two, decided to meet up with a man she'd previously met on a dating website. That guy was 45-year-old Stephen Sansom, who invited Sarah over to his flat. He invited her over saying that they could have sex and do some drugs. He wrote, quote, fancy a little party? Sarah was seen walking into the flat, but never seen walking out. According to prosecutors, Stephen's girlfriend, 49-year-old Gemma Watts, was inside the flat, and together they murdered Sarah. The next part is extra upsetting. Investigators still aren't sure when Sarah died or even how. Prosecutors believe she was killed sometime between March 8th and March 9th of 2024, but there is no exact time frame locked in. That means we still don't know how long Sarah was tortured before she was killed. We don't know how Sarah died either, because her body was dismembered after her murder. Some tests show that there was bruising to her skull and damaged vertebrae in her voice box, but besides that, we don't know much. Again, we don't know the exact date, but we're guessing this happened in early March of last year. But it wasn't until April 2nd, almost a month later, that pieces of Sarah's remains were recovered. A man had been walking his dog across a field in Croydon when he discovered a human bone. So he called police, and according to investigators, a pair of arms and legs were found, and the head, which has been cut up using power tools. The next month in May, Metropolitan Police were called to Mitcham in Merton, still in the area of South London, but a different borough than the one before. Officials were called to a construction site there, where contractors were doing some repair work, and they found a torso. Investigators very quickly determined this torso was connected to the other remains that had been found just the month prior. But these two locations were about 9 miles apart from each other, meaning that the killer, or killers in this case, moved these remains around kind of a lot. We now know that Stephen and Gemma carried the remains in a suitcase. It's still unclear why, but we do have CCTV footage of them with a suitcase and large bags. There's also footage of Stephen buying a 300mm hacksaw, a blade, and a 14-liter bucket at a hardware store. And Gemma, we have video of her buying some cleaning products just days after Sarah's murder. Eventually, both Stephen and Gemma admitted to the murder and dismemberment of Sarah Mayhew, and also that they attempted to clean up the scene. If all of this isn't upsetting enough, though, Stephen had already been convicted of murder. He'd just recently been released from prison, too. Stephen was convicted in the 1999 murder of a cab driver who he stabbed to death all over 25 pounds that he stole. After all this, Stephen apparently ran to a friend's house. He was covered in blood and then started laughing when he discussed these details. Stephen pleaded guilty in that case and was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years behind bars. So he served that and was released in 2019, meaning at the time of Sarah's murder, he was still on probation. Prosecutors highlighted all of this and the sick relationship between Stephen and Gemma right in open court. Past messages between the couple were shown in court. They chatted about things like bestiality, murder, and having sex with each other covered in a victim's blood. The courtroom heard this straight from Stephen, too, when a voice message was played in open court. He sent a message to Gemma on September 11th, 2023 and said, quote, everything looks like meat now, don't they? A plaything, something to cut, something to bleed. They all look different now. Gemma then replied, quote, wonder what they taste like. Cooked flesh. Maybe even so rare blood drips down our faces. The court also saw a screenshot of a note Gemma had sent to Stephen on September 7th, 2023. It reads, quote, "I'm writing this of my own free will. Should any serious injury or even death occur whilst I'm with Stephen Sansom, let it be made fully understood that I enter the act of violent, dangerous sex games with Stephen Sansom of my own free will." According to the Daily Mail, during the court proceedings, prosecutors said, quote, "The defendants acting together conducted the planned and premeditated bloodthirsty murder of Sarah Mayhew. It is a murder which the prosecution submit involved sexual and or sadistic conduct. Having committed the murder, they then made very extensive efforts to pervert the course of justice over a number of days." Ultimately, both Gemma Watts and Stephen Sansom pleaded guilty to the charges and were sentenced to life in prison. We're talking about another really gruesome case, and we're actually going to dig even deeper now. I'm going to bring in international attorney David Tafuri. And David, we have a lot to unpack in this case, but the thing that jumped out to me immediately right away, prosecutors calling these defendants bloodthirsty and sadistic. What do you make of that?
Well, unfortunately, because of the facts, they're accurate. They're not exaggerating. The facts here are about the worst that I've ever heard of in terms of the, intentional, premeditated act of murder. The and the fact that one of the defendants, Steve Sampson, was actually already in jail and convicted of a brutal murder 20 years earlier, and he spent 20 years in prison and just returned right back to his violent habits. And then the way that they dealt with the body afterwards, and they cut it up into pieces and they dragged it around in a suitcase and they dropped pieces of it in different places. They had no remorse at all. They talked about how they had done a good thing for the world in text messages or voice messages between each other after they murdered this poor woman. And one of the worst parts about it is, while we know they did it and we know how they got rid of the body, we don't know what happened after she went to this apartment. We know they murdered her. We don't know how long she was alive. We don't know what she went through before they killed her.
Your answer right there has like 10 different paths I could go down because there's so much to this case. But I think you're right that we can call it bloodthirsty and sadistic. But if we're going to the timeline, let's start at the beginning. You mentioned this too, that one of the defendants, Steve Sansom, had actually already been convicted of murder. In this case, he apparently stabbed a taxi driver, showed up at his friend's house covered in blood, and was laughing about the murder, evidently. So he's convicted and in prison. But why was he able to be released? I know here in the United States, oftentimes if you're convicted of murder, you're going to be in for life without parole. But is it different over there?
Yeah, the circumstances of that murder are also astonishing because he murdered a taxi cab driver on Christmas Day. The taxi cab driver had two young children. He was actually working to make taxi cab fares to buy Christmas gifts for his children. And Steve Sampson murdered him in cold blood after he had the taxi cab take him somewhere. And he got out of the murder. He got 25 pounds. So, just an unbelievable set of circumstances, so tragic for that family. And he got 20 years in prison. I don't know why that was the sentence. I would speculate that it has something to do with the fact that he was very young. He was 19 years old at the time he committed that murder. And perhaps the court felt that there was a chance that he could be rehabilitated, and that 20 years was appropriate for someone that young who might have been acting out of immaturity. But this was a cold-blooded murder, and he returned to murder afterwards, which is very unfortunate. And as I understand it, the UK authorities are investigating the parole board and kind of looking at whether he was on probation when he committed this second murder. And so there needs to be a review of whether he was being actively supervised and appropriately supervised given the gravity of his first crime.
It's so devastating that the reform didn't happen there, that he served more than a decade, 2 decades behind bars, and then just turned around and murdered once again. And you talked about the investigation with the parole board, but just so I understand, is it similar over in the UK as it is here, that if somebody has been convicted of a crime, they're on parole, that people would be supervising them, maybe checking in on them, checking up and watching, things like that?
That's right. It's not identical to a parole board, but he was in a circumstance where he had been released, but he was under supervision. And like having a probation officer here in the US, there was supposed to be constant contact with him to make sure that he was on the path towards rehabilitation.
And it turns out he was not on that path towards rehabilitation. He was on a completely different path of destruction. He ended up meeting up with a girlfriend, Gemma Watts, and together they're a very interesting couple. I don't know if that's the correct adjective. If we're looking into their text messages or their voicemails, as you were talking about, some of the things they touched on were sexual assault, bestiality, cannibalism, they were even talking about. So when investigators are going back and looking through their texts and messages and things like this, I mean, it's astonishing for me to hear. Do you think it's wild for them to read through all these things too?
Absolutely. I mean, the messages that I've seen, and I've only seen a small portion of them, are very disturbing. One of the messages Gemma writes to Steve and says, basically, if I die, or if I'm seriously injured, or I die in a sex act, it was by my own volition. And so she was even contemplating that she could be killed in activities with him, and obviously that somehow moved toward to them having this fantasy of killing someone else while in a sex act.
Which ultimately led to Sarah Mayhew, who's the victim in this case. Such a tragic instance. But she had apparently met Steve Sanson on a dating app or dating website years prior. Do you think it's safe to say that he reached out to her once again to lure her to the apartment with the intent to kill her and maybe even torture her during the process?
Based on the facts that the prosecutor submitted to the court, that's what it sounds like, that this was premeditated. He knew Ms. Mayhew from before. They had dated, met on this online app, and then he lured her to his apartment with the specific intention of engaging in criminal acts with Gemma, aimed at her. And ultimately, I think they had planned to murder her.
You pointed this out at the start of the interview, but I wanted to go back to it. The fact that we don't know for sure how long she was held before she was killed or how exactly she died, those moments are completely unaccounted for. Does that make things difficult for investigators and later prosecutors because we don't necessarily have a straightforward cause of death?
I don't think so, because there was overwhelming evidence otherwise that they had killed her, including there were, traces of blood found in their apartment in a bucket in the bathroom. And that was her blood. They were seen, both Stephen Sampson and Gemma were seen buying things that they needed to cover up the body and hide the body, including hacksaws and cleaning materials. Right after, they were seen carrying a heavy suitcase, and then there was messages between them about the fact that they disposed of a body in a suitcase. So there was incredible amount of evidence. Also, there was video of Ms. Mayhew going in to his apartment, and there's no video of her leaving. And we know Gemma was there because there's videos of her leaving the apartment the next day. So all of this is really compelling evidence that I think ultimately, enabled the court to feel confident that they committed the murder. But as I understand it, they actually confessed.
I think you're right. They did, in fact, confess to all of it. But leading up to the investigation, just going through and researching this case, it's so sad to read Sarah Mayhew went into the apartment and she was never seen walking out again. That is just so stark to me. And you pointed out a lot of evidence against this couple. I mean, we have the DNA, the blood, all of that stuff, super important. But then the circumstantial evidence of them with the hacksaws and this suitcase. And that's the part I wanted to focus on too. Because not only did they murder this young woman, but they dismembered her body, and it was found over at least an 8-mile difference area. The fact that they put her in a suitcase and left some pieces here, some pieces there, I do not understand this at all. What was their thought process, if you can try to put yourself in their brain or their thoughts, why they would leave some of her body over here, some over there, why carry it in that suitcase, or why even dismember it at all?
Well, I can't get into their heads, but presumably they felt that if they mutilated the body and they, you know, disposed of parts of it in different places, it would be harder to find and harder to identify. Obviously, with modern science uh, and forensic tools, it's often possible to figure out who a person is based on just a small body part. And that's what happened here because they knew they had parts from her before they found her torso. And so I don't, it certainly wasn't a very well planned murder if they didn't want to get caught. If you look at, recent murders, other murderers have been caught because they're seen going to the store afterwards to buy, you know, cleaning supplies. That's what happened here. There's video of them buying those things. So they did not do enough to cover up the murder. Thankfully, it was a really good thing that we're able to compile all of this evidence and know for certain who the culprits are so that they don't do this again. And I think we can assume, given the enjoyment, the sick enjoyment they got out of this, that they likely would have found another victim if they weren't caught after this murder.
I know that's a tough question to ask you, to put yourself in the shoes of these really just sadistic people, again, as prosecutors called them. And that's what I want to talk about now, is the prosecution in this case. I'm wondering if it's kind of similar to here in the United States. I mean, they did confess. If they're confessing, could they recant over there? What does all of that look like when it comes time for court proceedings?
I assume they always could try to recant, but you know, I think that they didn't attempt to do that. And so I think some of the things that the prosecutor said about the case were clearly intended to make sure that the court gave appropriate sentences to these two defendants, and especially to make sure this gentleman, Steve Sansom, never sees the light of day again, given that he repeated a murder after already serving a very lengthy sentence, 20 years. And so I think the reason that they call them sadistic and bloodthirsty and describe some of the really disturbing facts was to make sure the court understood the depravity of these two individuals.
One thing I wanted to ask you specifically is, obviously they've got the murder charge. That one makes sense to me. But there was a different one called perverting the course of justice. That's not something I've heard here in the United States. What would that mean over there?
Right. That is a charge related to the fact that they mutilated the body and hid the body. And uh, I think we don't have a similar sounding charge, but here we would have mutilation or other charges depending on the state you're in, and so that's what that relates to, is the crime of murder happened, but it's a separate crime when you seek to cover it up and you mutilate a body to do so, and that's what that relates to. And my understanding is they got 5 years each, concurrent, to be served concurrently with the sentences they got for the murder charge.
That checks out with that charge. Just the different verbiage, I guess, is what had me confused. But I'm glad you explained it there. Talking about the sentencing, yes, they did get the 5 years for that, what we would call mutilation of a body or a corpse. But as far as their sentences, if we break them down, Steven Sanson, you said this before. Do you think it's fair this guy's never getting out of prison again? Zero possibility, will never walk free.
That's what it sounds like to me. He has a life sentence, what we would call a life sentence, with no eligibility for parole. And given the attention this got across the country, I can't imagine there would be an intention to release him. But over the many years that he will still be alive, the law can change. There is this trend in Europe where courts tend not to give life sentences in as many cases, hoping that there's a possibility of rehabilitation and reimmersion into society. I don't think any of those things are possible, and I don't think any reasonable court would think those are possible for this gentleman. So I expect he won't ever be released from prison, but you never know what might happen in the future, especially as laws change and trends change and we deal with criminality in different ways.
I think you and I in the past on a separate international story had talked about that European trend of having the shorter sentences in hopes for rehabilitation, which ultimately is what we hope for in prison and sentences altogether. Back to Gemma, though. Gemma Watts, the other defendant in all of this, she has to serve 30 years. And I'm more worried about this one that potentially she could be released after the 30 years. What would it look like if it comes time for that 3 decades down the line? Is there a sort of parole board that would go through and see what she's like behind bars, reassess the crime itself?
Yes, and my understanding is she got a life sentence, but with a minimum sentence of 30 years. So the, under that their system, I think that means she has to serve 30 years. She could be released after 30 years. Obviously, that would depend on good behavior and a decision about whether she's been rehabilitated, whether she's remorseful, whether she can, you know, whether she can transition to back into civilian life. And I think the question, though, also the court probably struggled with is this is a woman who's 48 years old. So in 30 years, she'll be 78. And maybe the court is thinking, well, we could be okay with releasing a 78-year-old. She wouldn't, be as capable of engaging in criminal behavior. But even then, you don't know. And it's going to really depend on the circumstances and how she is as a prisoner and her behavior and whether she's able to communicate in appropriate and effective ways with what is tantamount to a parole board in their country to convince them that she should be released. But given the circumstances of this case, the facts, it's a bit bothersome to think that she would ever also be out and in society again. It's troubling.
You're right. The details of this case are really one of the more gruesome ones I've covered. Just devastating for Sarah Mayhew, her family, everyone involved. But it does seem that justice was served in this case. David DeFury, thank you for coming on with us and talking about it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sarah Gillespie.